I may have been wrong about modern fantasy, or maybe particularly my so-called criticism of romantasy in the modern fantasy era. Now, I watched this wonderful panel called The Shifting Landscape of Epic Fantasy that was hosted by the SFF podcast. It was amazing. I literally watched it twice. It was that good, and it's like 2 hours. So would definitely recommend giving it a watch. But panel with George R. R. Martin, Brandon Sanderson, Robin Hobb, Ryan Cahill, and Rebecca Roanhorse. Genuinely perfect panel. But listening to these guys discuss the changing landscape of fantasy has just made me realize that in the past I've probably been a bit too narrow focus of my critiques of modern fantasy, if that makes any sense. Just pop the table down a bit. So today I wanted to react to some of the things they said in this panel, and I'll get to how I think my mind has changed a bit about romantasy again. So let's just have a look, shall we?
Robin, we'll toss it over to you in terms of what was epic fantasy like when you first encountered it?
My first encounter was there wasn't much of it that I could find. I mean, after the Lord of...
Did you catch that? There wasn't much I could find. Let's see what George R. R. Martin says to the exact same question. So,
well, what did the genre look like when I started? Now, I'm a lot older than all these other people. There was no genre when I started. There was fantasy, certainly. Fantasy goes back way back. Gilgamesh and the Greek.
Just have to say, George R. R. Martin has such an iconic voice, mate. I just can't get over it. But let's just hear his answer.
Myths and the Roman myths, all of those things were there. And in later generations, there were occasional fantasy stories, plays. Shakespeare wrote fantasy with, elves and Midsummer's Night's Dream and Three Witches in the Woods and stuff like that. But what we think of as epic fantasy did not exist.
What we thought of epic fantasy didn't exist. Now, I don't want to come across here as I'm a massive romantasy hater, because I think that would be a bit unfair. Whenever I've talked about romantasy on my channel, I would say 9 out of 10 times, it's been quite in a neutral way. I made fun out of Fourth Wing a lot, but I feel like you can make fun out of Fourth Wing, right? But I made a video a couple years ago called Epic Fantasy is Dying and It's Making Me Sad. And I basically proposed that it looks like traditional epic fantasy that I have primarily on my shelves here is starting to suffer. And I proposed some arguments for publishers are limiting how long books can be. I showed some tweets from other authors where they've said stuff about, publishers not focusing as much on traditional epic fantasy anymore because of romantasy has become so popular. And I basically just said other authors are saying these things. It looks like my favorite genre of fantasy is suffering. And basically what I just wanted from the video, and what I still want today, is I don't want romantasy to go away. I just want both of them to thrive. And I propose that it may be that romantasy is taken over more and more rather than both of them are thriving. So that was my main thesis in that video around 2 years ago. Well, listen to this guys talk about the changing landscape of fantasy has changed my mind, and here's why. Firstly, I think that my critiques have been very much looking at the short term when it comes to epic fantasy. It's absolutely fascinating to listen to Robin Hobb and George R. R. Martin literally say that they wanted to read more Tolkien kind of fantasy, and it literally did not exist at all. Now fast forward to 2025 where we are now today, and if I go into any bookshop, mate, there is so much fantasy. And there's not only like my kind of fantasy, there's also lit RPG, there's romantasy, there's YA. There is so much. And therefore I can just imagine in the past when people, especially maybe people like George R. R. Martin or those people in those age groups have listened to, that video where I critique the epic fantasy or in the state of epic fantasy, they probably just thought like, when I grew up, there was literally nothing, and I was concerned that epic fantasy wasn't thriving in, 2023, 2024. And I just can see now that it was a bit short-sighted of me in that video. I just realized that if I just zoom out a bit, there is just so much fantasy for me to enjoy, and I shouldn't be that worried about romantasy. I mean, again, not that I'm like already worried about it or anything, but I just, you know, when I in the past critiqued Romantasy, it's been with this short-sighted view of looked at a very short time span, and these guys that have been living for 70 years that have been looking for other fantasies and they didn't have any growing up. But yeah, it has just made me think a bit. But there is more. So in this next clip here, Brandon Sanderson, he talks about the development of fantasy in the 80s and 90s. So in this panel, they talk about how Tolkien came into the scene. He basically created the genre called epic fantasy, and then there was a huge development. And then in the 80s and 90s, a lot of like Tolkien-esque fantasies, like traditional medieval farm boy to hero fantasies, were everywhere. And Sanderson has a really interesting viewpoint about the state of fantasy in the 80s and 90s. So let's just have a listen to this, shall we?
That Brandon is laying upon you.
I meant it as a compliment. I think that stepping out of Tolkien's shadow at that point was a really important thing for the genre, because the people in the 80s did wonderful things, really interesting things, but I felt like we needed to grow as a genre.
Fascinating. So yeah, he's just talked about how in the late 90s authors started trying to get out of Tolkien's shadow, and he just said like there's nothing wrong with the fantasy in the 80s and 90s, but the fantasy genre needed to evolve. So why am I making this point here? Basically what I'm saying here is that fantasy has really benefited whenever it stepped out of its comfort zone. So when Tolkien came to the scene and he did something totally new that no one had really seen before, a whole genre was created and it massively benefited us. Then we come to the 80s and 90s and lots of other similar stories start to pop up, and it's really beautiful. But then go into the 90s and we start seeing the Wheel of Time, which is like a blend of what we would call modern fantasy today and traditional fantasy. We have Ted Williams doing some really interesting things. George R.R. Martin basically, you could argue, creates or at least popularizes grimdark as a genre. We have Steven Erikson in the late 90s also doing some crazy things with military fantasy, and also Glenn Cook. And then obviously in the early 2005s, Brandon Sanderson joins the scene, and N.K. Jemisin's that do some really, you know, totally different things than what the fantasy genre has done. And every time authors have done something different for the fantasy genre, even though it might have been scary, the genre has benefited. You know, I am sure that when George R. R. Martin wrote A Song of Ice and Fire and someone picked up that book, they were probably horrified by reading a book that had so many graphic elements, that had so many morally grey characters in it. But you know what? Even though there's a lot of people that probably didn't like that and wanted that, it was a good thing for the fantasy genre. Brandon Sanderson comes to the scene and he popularizes hard magic systems. And you know, someone might have picked up Brandon Sanderson's books and hoping to get something like A Song of Ice and Fire, and they were probably disappointed because there's no dragons and it was hard magic systems. But you know, the genre benefited from someone doing something different. Now, I think you know where I'm going with this. We're now in 2025, and for the past 3 or 4 years, we have seen a new kind of fantasy that has been absolutely popularized called Romantasy. And now I am in the boat where I pick up a Romantasy book and I don't like it. It's just not for me. That's not why I read fantasy. But I must say the conclusion has to be the same. Overall, it must be good for the genre that it is branching out to new areas that it hasn't really ventured before. And also later on in this panel, Sanderson makes this really great point that he almost lost interest in fantasies in the 80s and 90s because it all just looked the same again and again. But fortunately for him, he was able to finally find other fantasies that did something different, and he fell back in love with the fantasy. And he even just makes this point that if you're tired of fantasy, you might not be tired of fantasy. You might just be tired of a specific kind of fantasy. And now, in this day and age, there's so much fantasy out there that almost whatever kind of fantasy you want, if you want lit RPG, the Romantasy, and all those different subgenres that are out there, you can actually find it, which is a beautiful thing. Always, let me just make it clear, I'm not saying I'm a huge fan of Romantasy still. I am still, you know, a bit worried about the normalization of really graphic sexual content, for example. I don't think that's beneficial generally for especially younger readers. So I'm not saying, you know, Romantasy is only a good thing, but seeing fantasy branch out to new areas is a good thing, especially in the long term. I think, you know, after Romantasy, we might see some other things. And also the other point is that now when we come to the fantasy genre, readers are coming from Dungeon Crawler Carl, we have Lord of the Rings, we have The Wheel of Time, we have Fourth Wing, we have Historic Materials, we have Narnia. All those readers that are so different and probably enjoy fantasy for different reasons are now coming together for the same passion. And that must be a great thing. So just to clarify here, I'm making a very specific point, and that is that in the long term, the fantasy genre benefits when it branches out, which it is currently doing. Now, I know Romantasy is a very hot topic, and you can literally take the discussions about the rise of Romantasy in 1,000 different ways. I know I'll probably see comments down below saying that I am justifying books like this, and I think those are a good thing. That's not what I'm saying. I'm literally just saying it's probably likely that in the long term, this branching out is a good thing for the genre. But I want to bring some nuance to this discussion I've just been having, because there is also a drawback I just want to bring your attention to that again Brandon Sanderson brings up. All these members on this panel are amazing, but Brandon Sanderson, I would just love to sit down with Brandon Sanderson and just have a glass of wine. Oh, he's a Mormon. He doesn't drink wine. A coffee. He doesn't drink coffee. Pepsi Max. Drink a glass of Pepsi Max with Brandon Sanderson and just chat about fantasy, because I just feel like his brain and his way to articulate is just on a different level. Okay, that's funny. Latter-day Saints do not drink caffeine, so Pepsi Max would be off the table. Brandon Sanderson, you want to grab a glass of juice with me or something? So in this next clip here, Sanderson talks about the late 90s of fantasy genre, which was a very, very bleak period according to him, to the fantasy genre. So let's just hear what he has to say, and I'll give some thoughts.
And if you know anything about the history of epic fantasy, I'll stop after this, but the late 90s, early 2000s were really hard for epic fantasy. We had George and Robin come out and sell really well, and then the editors learned the wrong lesson. Okay, just a little quick one. So Robert Jordan missed the deadline, and they slotted a Terry Goodkind book into that slot. They already had all the money and funding for the publicity of it, and they just spent that on Goodkind instead and made him a giant bestseller. The publishers all thought, we can take anything and make it an epic fantasy bestseller. And then there were 4 or 5 enormous flops. And in the meantime, people were jumping over and reading Interview with the Vampire, and they were reading Harry Potter. And really, Steven Erikson is the only person during that era that really broke out. And even it was really hard because only the Brits were willing to buy and read.
Don't point at me when you say Brits.
It was over that way. It was toward the Brits, beyond you.
You are the token Brit on this panel. In the periphery.
They have to go past you. And so, they were the only ones that, Erikson, I believe Steven Erikson is Canadian, but he sold in the UK. Yeah. So, real big dearth for a while, and I think the shakeup was really good though in the end. But it took till 2005 for me and Rothfuss and Nora Jameson to sell before epic fantasy, I think, really kind of recovered.
All right, I know I let that go on for quite a while. It's just a joy to listen to Sanderson, mate. He is amazing, isn't he? But here's the thing I want to bring to the discussion. Just this one point here, because I've been quite positive now on the branching of Romantasy. But I do think it is worth noting that when we see a major boom or a major trend, there is always a risk that what happened in the late 90s that Sanderson has been talking about can happen again. So as I said, in the late 90s, publishers invested millions into books that absolutely flopped, and it almost destroyed the genre temporarily. And that could happen again. I'm not saying it is, but I'm just saying Fourth Wing has sold 12 million copies or something. Insane. And if the publishers now just go out and try to recreate that again, and they maybe spend millions on buying rights to books that are just bad, then that can be incredibly damaging for the fantasy genre, especially in the short term, because there'll just be less money for the authors that actually deserve it. And therefore, I think it's just important that we on the internet, and this is also definitely applies to myself, that we try to figure out why people criticize the things they criticize. When someone is criticizing Romantasy, they might criticize it because they hate it, but other people might criticize it because they're worried that all the money is going to potentially really bad books, and they're worried about the long-term impact of that. But what Sanderson said there at the end of this clip I just showed still rings true. That shake-up was still a good thing in the end. So even if, if we go into an era, and I'm not saying we are, but if the next 2 years we see a lot of really bad books for one reason or another, that might still be a good shake-up in the long term. But yeah, I could have made 20 videos about this panel because they go into so many interesting things, but I'll just leave it here. If you are interested in me unpicking other discussions they had, let me know, but I'll leave the link in the description down below. Please go and give this a watch. It is so brilliant, and thank you to Fantasy Addict for actually posting this online because it is incredible. Let me know if you agree with me or disagree with me on this discussion we've had.